Folks, we're going to talk about the Great Depression for a few moments, and I want to refer you to the images that accompany this lecture. I'm going to comment on these images, and I'll make a few comments at the end. This first image illustrates something that's quite common during especially the early 1930s, and that's a bank run. Many of you have seen the classic film, what's the title? It's a Wonderful Life, with Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed. You remember Jimmy Stewart plays, what's the character's name? George Bailey, who owns a small savings and loan in a New England town. And he and Donna Reed have finally gotten enough money to get married and to go on their honeymoon. And as they're leaving town, they see crowds of people rushing to the banks. George Bailey gets out of his taxi, goes back to the bank, finds that there's burglar bars or a metal gate over the doors. The bank is closed. This, of course, has created panic in the town. People are worried about their deposits and their accounts. This is a bank run. If you have a copy of this film, and you might even be able to Google or to YouTube this particular scene from the film, it's very enlightening to show the sort of mass panic that accompanies a bank run. This is a common occurrence through the Great Depression. If you're watching the news today, you may be aware of the fact that Greece is unable to meet its financial obligations to the EU and may withdraw from the European Union. The political and economic consequences of this are unpredictable. So these type of events are not relegated to history. They still occur today. In the United States, the Great Depression begins traditionally with the collapse of the stock market in 1929 and then continues through the 1930s. The traditional explanation, of course, is that the Great Depression is alleviated by the Second World War. During the Second World War, Americans all go back to work, and there is no unemployment. And the U.S. economy rides this boom from the Second World War all the way through the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. The great significance of the Great Depression, I guess there's a couple. One, it looks as if capitalism has failed. And many people in the United States begin to believe that these alternative political systems in Europe that we discussed previously, with fascism in Italy and in Nazi Germany, Soviet command economy in Russia, that perhaps capitalism is not the path that we should continue on, that maybe there are alternative political systems might be better. A second significance is that this is easily the greatest economic catastrophe in modern times in the Western world. The unemployment rate rose to about 25%. Countless people lost their homes, lost their businesses, millions thrown into the streets. And it demonstrated the difficulty for government to try to solve this problem. Certainly, President Roosevelt threw everything he could think of at the Great Depression, and we'll talk about the New Deal in a moment. And he did alleviate a lot of the suffering. But I would say that the fundamental structure of the economy was really cured by the Second World War and the demand for huge production of tanks and planes and all the material needed for war. So let's take a look at some of these photographs. This is interesting. You see two middle-class American men who have been thrown out of work. They're wearing their best clothes. They're on a busy downtown street. Wanted a decent job. And then it gives a brief bio, a little biographical account. It's kind of like, I guess it's kind of like 1930s Facebook, letting everyone see your character and what you're about. Look at these men gathered here on the street. See the sign? Free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed. You'll notice these men are wearing their best clothes. I guess standing in line with your peers, where you can exchange stories of your misery, is better than staying home and having to face your wife and your children whom you no longer can support. Misery loves company. That's the old cliche, isn't it? Look at this photograph of the children in a downtown street carrying signs. Why can't you give my dad a job? Children, of course, have always been useful when it comes to selling. Here's a family living in their new residence, a tent. You see people living in cardboard boxes, people cobbling together pieces of tin and other things they find in junkyards to create shelter for themselves. Picture of a family somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains. You see father and mother here with, it looks like 3 children and the mother-in-law. It's difficult to imagine the level of poverty that these people live at, and it's difficult to imagine what they look forward to. Of course, for many people in the Appalachian region, the Great Depression did not change things. Things had been this way for some over the generations. And then this, of course, is one of the most famous photographs from the Great Depression. You can see this young woman, probably in her mid-20s. Looks like she's in her mid-50s. I need to say a word here about the 2 presidents that are going to be engaged in this problem of the Great Depression. The first is Herbert Hoover, and I introduced him last time. Hoover, I think we can characterize as being enchained by his ideas of laissez-faire. He believes that the government has no useful role in the economy. He believes that government aid, which he would regard as charity, to the American people would essentially, instead of helping them, would destroy their character. President Hoover took those cliches of individualism very seriously. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, rugged individualism. These type of things were very true to him. And he did not believe that the government had a role in alleviating the misery of the Great Depression. He would take steps as he got deeper into his administration and as the Depression worsened. But psychologically, Hoover was never comfortable with trying to help the American people through this catastrophe. The people, of course, realized this, and you can see these photographs of Hoovervilles. These are little shanty towns that emerge around metropolitan areas where out-of-work men gather and create these little shanty villages in the hope of finding a job in industry. They call them Hoovervilles, and that's not a tribute. That's named in ridicule of the president who cannot or will not help them. Now, if you have Hoover on the one hand, who is psychologically unable to deal with the demands of the Great Depression, you have FDR on the other, and President Roosevelt was not in any way shackled by laissez-faire. Roosevelt said he'd try everything, and indeed he did. The famous New Yorker cover here of the inauguration, you see Hoover and FDR in the same limousine riding to the inauguration at the Capitol. Hoover, quite frankly, looks constipated, and you can see that FDR looks like he'd like to have another drink. These 2 men in temperament, in psychology, and in approach could not be more different. The Great Depression demanded a politician who was practical and pragmatic and had the courage to try anything, and they got it with Franklin Roosevelt. I want to say a couple of things about an ecological disaster that takes place during the Great Depression. As if the economic collapse in the country was not enough, we have in the mid-30s what's called the Dust Bowl. And here storms coming down out of the upper plains blow the topsoil away from the Dakotas all the way to Texas. This, of course, is going to ruin countless farmers and even exaggerate the misery that they've already been going through. Ken Burns has a nice documentary film on the Dust Bowl that I recommend to you. I want to recommend to you a couple of films that you might be interested in taking a look at that are set in the context of the Great Depression. One is Seabiscuit. This is a true story following a racehorse in the 1930s, an underdog, certainly, that the American people fell in behind and began to support. This film stars Jeff Bridges, as I recall, and it does a nice job of depicting the psychological damage done to especially American men who suddenly are no longer able to take care of their families. The psychological damage done here is hard to measure. Men abandoning their families because of the shame and humiliation of not being able to provide for them after losing their jobs, their businesses, their homes. Seabiscuit I recommend, and I also recommend a classic film from 1940 while the Great Depression was still going on. This is The Grapes of Wrath, based on John Steinbeck's famous novel. I recommend the novel as well. It's beautifully written. The film stars Henry Fonda, and here you see the consequences of the Dust Bowl as farmers from the Midwest have to pack what they have left on their wagons or their automobile and then head west, trying to find a job maybe in California, picking lettuce or some sort of produce. A beautiful film and novel. And then the other film that I recommend is one I've already mentioned to you, Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, with a marvelous depiction of a bank run. A couple of more things about the Great Depression, a couple of key terms you should be familiar with. One of these terms is buying on margin. Here what happens is it's a sense of, in the late 20s, there's a sense that you can get rich quick on the stock market. And that, so what people would do, of course, is borrow money from their bank, purchase stock with that loan, in anticipation of that stock value rising. Well, what happens when the stock value no longer rises? It levels off and then begins to fall. Your first instinct, of course, is to sell that stock. Well, what if millions and millions of people across the country have the same instinct, to sell a suddenly falling stock? What happens to the value of that stock? It decreases even more and very rapidly. So those who have borrowed money to buy stock and then the stock prices collapse, they still have that loan to pay back. This is going to drive a lot of people into bankruptcy. It's going to drive businesses into bankruptcy, even other banks into bankruptcy. Banks speculate on the market just as individuals do. Another key term, the Holy Smoot tariff, and we'll give you spellings on this. This tariff is a result of government, the United States government, trying to protect domestic industry from foreign competition. Now, what effect does this have on the Great Depression? It worsens it worldwide. Many countries begin imposing a tariff on imports. As each country does this to protect their own domestic industry, the result is a shutdown in international trade, which simply exaggerates the ill effects of this economic disaster. One last comment here about the Great Depression. Fundamentally, I think it can be said that by the late 20s, business inventories had backed up. Warehouses were full of unsold appliances. Farmers could not get the prices for their crops and their commodities that they used to. There was simply too much of everything. There was surpluses. And of course, we know what happens to the value of something when there's too much of it. The value drops, of course. And as values drop, we don't need as many workers and we don't need as many salesmen, do we? So we continue to throw people out of work until the unemployment rate reaches 25%, which constitutes an economic catastrophe for the country. Now, next time, we're going to talk about President Roosevelt and his New Deal, his attempt to remedy this crisis that has reached across the board and has affected nearly every American. We'll talk about the New Deal next. Thank you.